The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October of 1971. It was not a rumor, it was not a newspaper headline, it was typed on official letterhead, signed at the bottom in a firm and deliberate hand, and delivered by messenger to Bruce Lee's home in Kowloon. The messenger waited at the door. Bruce Lee read it standing in the hallway. When he finished, he folded it once, set it on the table, and thanked the messenger for his trouble. He did not reply that day. He did not reply the next day either. The woman who sent the letter had 43 professional wins, 0 losses. In 11 years of competing against the best available opposition in Southeast Asia, against opponents who had studied her, prepared for her, trained specifically to find the gap in her that everyone assumed existed but nobody had found, she had not lost once. Not been submitted, not been knocked down, not been made by any opponent she had faced to feel uncertain about how the match would end. She had sent Bruce Lee a formal challenge, and Bruce Lee had let 2 days pass without answering. On the 3rd day, he wrote a single sentence on a piece of paper, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it back. What that sentence was, nobody outside of a very small circle ever confirmed, not because it was secret exactly, but because the one person who received it never told it to more than one person, and that person published it only once, decades later, in a small journal that most people never read. But here is what is known. Here is the part that everyone in Hong Kong's martial arts community knew within 48 hours, because the kind of information that matters moves through small communities, whether or not anyone intends it to. The woman who had sent the challenge, 43 wins, 0 losses, 11 years undefeated, read Bruce Lee's single sentence. And then she withdrew the challenge entirely. Without explanation, without a public statement, without the careful face-saving language that serious people use when they retreat from a public position. She simply sent word that the challenge was no longer open. And for the rest of her career, 3 more years, 9 more victories, retirement at 52 and 0, she never explained why. This is that story. And the sentence at the center of it is the most interesting thing Bruce Lee ever said, not because it is known, but because of what the person who received it did with it for the rest of her life. Her name was Vivian Lau, and she was the most decorated female combat athlete in the history of Hong Kong's martial arts circuit. 43 professional matches, 43 wins. She had never been knocked down. She had never been submitted. She had never, in 11 years of competing at every level available to her, met an opponent who had made her genuinely uncertain about the outcome before a match began. She was also, by every account of every serious practitioner who had encountered her, something considerably more than her record. Records can be manufactured against weak opposition. Vivian Lau's record had been built against the best available opposition in Southeast Asia, against opponents who had prepared specifically for her, and had studied her patterns and her technique, and had brought to each of those 43 matches everything they had. She had defeated all of them. In September of 1971, 1 month before the letter, Vivian Lau had given an interview to a Hong Kong sports magazine that had attracted significant attention. The interviewer had asked her, in the context of a broader discussion about the state of martial arts in Asia, what she thought of Jeet Kune Do. Her answer was specific, considered, and, depending on your perspective, either a legitimate professional critique or a deliberate provocation. She said that Jeet Kune Do, as presented to the public through Bruce Lee's film work and public demonstrations, appeared to her as a synthesis rather than an art, a collection of borrowed elements from existing disciplines, assembled attractively, but lacking the foundational depth that comes from a discipline developed through sustained competitive testing against serious opposition.
She said she respected Bruce Lee's physical gifts. She said she did not believe those gifts had been tested in the way that competitive practice tests things. She said there was a difference between being exceptional in controlled demonstration and being exceptional in uncontrolled conditions of a real exchange.
The interview was published in the first week of October. Within 72 hours, the letter had been written, typed on official letterhead, signed, and delivered by messenger to Bruce Lee's home in Kowloon. The letter was a formal challenge. It proposed a private exhibition match, no judges, no public audience beyond a small group of witnesses from both parties, no stakes beyond the professional question the interview had raised. It proposed a date 3 weeks from the letter's delivery, a neutral venue to be agreed upon, and standard safety conditions. It was professional in its language. It was respectful in its tone. It contained nothing theatrical. But it was a challenge, unambiguously. Vivian Lau, 43-0, was formally asking Bruce Lee to demonstrate, under conditions that removed the variables of camera work and choreography, exactly what Jeet Kune Do was. Bruce Lee read the letter on Tuesday morning. He set it on the hallway table. He did not reply for 2 days. During those 2 days, the letter itself became news, not because its contents had been publicized, because they hadn't, but because the messenger had been seen, the letterhead had been recognized, and the Hong Kong martial arts community is a small enough world that significant information tends to move through it quickly and without needing anyone to announce it deliberately. By Wednesday evening, the broad outline of what had happened was known to most of the people who cared about such things, even if the specific contents of the letter remained private. The community's reaction was divided in the specific way that communities divide when 2 figures they respect are placed in apparent opposition. Some said Vivian Lau asked the right question and deserved an answer. Some said the question itself was unfair, that comparing competitive practice to Jeet Kune Do was like comparing different languages and asking which one was more grammatically correct. Some said the whole thing would resolve itself quickly because Bruce Lee would either accept or decline, and the matter would be settled. Nobody predicted what actually happened. On Thursday morning, 3 days after the letter arrived, Vivian Lau received the reply. The envelope was ordinary, no letterhead, no formal stationery. Inside was a single piece of paper. On the paper was a single sentence, nothing else. The sentence was in Chinese. No one outside of Vivian Lau and the small number of people she eventually told has ever confirmed the exact words. What is known, from those accounts gathered over years, is that the sentence was not a refusal. It was not an acceptance. It was not a counterproposal or a request for more time or any of the conventional responses that a formal challenge can receive. It was a question. A single question, written in Bruce Lee's hand, that, according to Vivian Lau's own account given privately to a close colleague many years later, stopped her entirely. Not because the question was clever, not because it was philosophical or evasive or designed to change the subject, because it was the exact question, stated in the most precise possible language, that went to the center of what she had actually been asking in the interview, and went further than she had gone, in a direction she had not considered, and arrived at a place that made the original challenge feel like it had been built on a premise she had not fully examined. She said she sat with it for a long time before she understood what she was feeling. And what she was feeling, she said, was not intimidated, not outmaneuvered, not handled in any of the ways a formal challenge can be handled when the challenged party wants to avoid the consequences. What she felt was something more specific,
The feeling of someone who has asked with confidence and preparation what they believe is the central question, and has received in return a response that shows them the central question was not what they thought it was. She read it twice. She set it down. She walked to the window of her office and stood there for several minutes. Then she called her manager and told him to send word that the challenge was withdrawn. She trained for 3 more years after that autumn. She added 9 more victories to her record, bringing it to 52-0 when she retired in 1974. In every interview she gave during those 3 years, she was asked at some point about the Bruce Lee letter, because the story of the challenge and the withdrawal had circulated, even if its details remained private. She always answered the same way. She said it was a private matter, and she had nothing to add to what was already known. What was already known was very little. A letter, a reply, a withdrawal. The colleague to whom she eventually described Bruce Lee's question, a training partner named Siu Wei-lin, who'd worked with her for 8 of her 11 competitive years, said she told him the story only once in 1979, 6 years after the letter and 3 years after her retirement, and by then 6 years after Bruce Lee's death. She told it in the way people tell things they have held for a long time and have finally decided can be set down, completely, with the specificity of something remembered with care, but without the emotional weight that would have been present if it were being told closer to when it happened. She said she had spent the days before the reply feeling more confident about the challenge than she had felt about any match in her competitive career. Not because she underestimated Bruce Lee. She had watched him carefully, had studied whatever footage existed, had thought seriously about his physical capabilities, but because the question her interviewer had raised was, she believed, a legitimate one, and the challenge was the most direct way she knew to address a legitimate question. She said she had felt the challenge was right in the way that clear things feel right, not comfortable but accurate. She said the reply made her understand that the question she had been asking was not the question she thought it was. She said the question Bruce Lee sent back was so specific, so precisely directed at the exact place where her own thinking had a gap she hadn't known was there, that reading it felt less like receiving a counterargument and more like having someone hand you a mirror you hadn't known was missing. She said, "I withdrew the challenge because I realized I didn't know the answer to his question. And someone who can ask that question in that way, in response to what I asked, I had no standing to be challenging anything." Siu Wei-lin said he asked her whether she thought about it often in the years after. She said she thought about it the way she thought about her most difficult matches, not as something she returned to with regret, but as something that had permanently changed the way she understood what she was doing. She said, "He never answered my question. He asked me a better one." Siu Wei-lin kept the account private for many years. He shared it publicly only once in a small martial arts journal article published in 1988, in a piece about the way significant exchanges in martial arts often left no visible trace in the public record. He included Vivian Lau's story, without naming her, describing her only as a female champion with a long undefeated record, as an example of what he meant. He described Bruce Lee's question as the most efficient thing he had ever heard of anyone saying in the context of a martial arts exchange. Not because it ended the challenge, because of how it ended it, not by shutting a door, but by opening one that Vivian Lau had not known existed, and showing her that she needed to walk through it before she had any business standing at the door she had been knocking on. She walked through it. Over 3 more years of training, in the private work of her school, she worked on what the question had pointed toward. She never said publicly whether she arrived anywhere. She simply kept working, won 9 more matches, and retired undefeated at 52. The letter itself, Bruce Lee's reply, the single sentence on the ordinary piece of paper, was never found. Whether Vivian Lau kept it or destroyed it or simply lost it in the years that followed, no one who knew her ever said. What she kept was the question. She carried it through 3 more years of competition and past her retirement, and through the quiet years that followed, in the way genuinely useful things get carried, not as a burden, but as an instrument, something that continued to be useful long after the specific situation that produced it had ended. In 1988, the year Su Wei-lin's article was published, someone who had read it wrote a letter to the journal asking whether the female champion in the story had been identified and whether the question Bruce Lee had asked was known. The journal did not publish a response. Some questions, once asked, belong to the person they were asked of, and some things are kept precisely because they are too useful to be given away. If this story reminded you that the sharpest response to a challenge is sometimes the question the challenger forgot to ask, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more stories about the man behind the legend, because Bruce Lee never needed to win an argument. He only needed to find the question that made the argument unnecessary.